So, just some thoughts on the whole Trump airstrike on Syria thing. Now, for those of you who are watching this, I don't know, a couple weeks, a couple days later, the current date is April the 14th. So, it's what, like 12 hours, I think, at this point after Trump launched his missile strikes. And at the moment, the thinking is, and what General Mattis and what Trump have said, is that this was a one-time shot, that this was in direct response to a direct action made by Assad by using chemical weapons against the Syrian opposition and in particular against civilian population. So they think this destroyed a lot of the Syrian chemical weapons capacity, which I really doubt. That just seems like some attempt to play up an attack that I presume really didn't do very much. There's a lot of debate at this point whether how many of the missiles actually landed, how many the Syrians and or Russians were able to shoot down. So we don't really know, and we probably won't know for a couple days what happened and what the fallout is. Is this the beginning of some great like of another Iraq war, of another Libya, or is this going to just be a one-time thing? It's very unclear at the moment. Everything's in a state of complete anarchy, and nobody knows what's going on. The last week has represented kind of a complete break with Trump's previous policy. True, last year he had fired a couple missiles at a Syrian airbase, but he had given them a large amount of time to evacuate, and I don't think anybody actually died from that. So that just seemed to be a token gesture to appease the international community. So this seems a bit higher level, but we don't really know like what was going on behind the scenes. And I think that lack of certainty is really the thing that we all have to worry about. Because Trump was pretty consistent during his candidacy that he was against any military action against Syria because he didn't really know what was going on. And the situation was unstable enough, and that Assad was the least bad action of those remaining. And now he started calling him an animal. He started talking about we need regime change in Syria. So I don't really know what's even going on, and nobody does. And lack of certainty in international politics is really bad. Like when I was studying foreign relations in university, people who kind of both realists and liberals, I guess kind of more traditional liberal means something a bit different in the field of international relations, often take the approach that states should be very open with their actions and should share information, especially with their opponents, so that their actions aren't misinterpreted and their opponents don't act based on kind of a misinterpretation. So, what I mean in this case is Russia might view this as a prelude to a wider conflict. They might see, okay, America is going to full out invade Syria, or they're going to provide open support to the opposition until Assad's overthrown. Whereas if they could otherwise provide the sign that this was something Trump had to do to appease aspects of his government, the American public, or his allies, and that this was just kind of a token gesture, albeit one that shot a lot of missiles, and it's not going to be repeated. So if Russia views this as an act of war, an act of hostility, this thing is going to spiral out of control really quickly. And that's kind of the fear, and that's kind of, I think, the big issue, is Trump is known for making very rash decisions, and he frankly does appear to be a bit unstable. I'm not jumping on the whole Trump is insane bandwagon, but I think most people who have read his Twitter or have followed him in the past know that the man is very predisposed towards sudden grand gestures, just kind of doing things spur of the moment, not really knowing what he's doing, etc. And this leading to really dramatic results, his rashness. So maybe in this case, his rashness has finally gone too far. So, kind of a bit of the background on what the situation was in Syria. Syria was noted for having the most chemical weapons, particularly sarin nerve gas, of any country. It's not a conspiracy theory to say that chemical weapons aren't all over the place in Syria. Now, I guess the first question we have to ask is who has the capacity to do this? My answer would be everybody. Is it feasible that some of Syria's huge amounts of chemical weapons were taken by rebels during this conflict? Yeah, I don't know if that's been confirmed, but that seems extremely likely that large quantities of it have been taken. Like, we don't even know who the rebel groups are. They talk about the Syrian opposition. You have like dozens of them. You have ISIS, you have the fake liberals, you have Al Qaeda, you have the Kurds. Who knows who actually has the capacity to launch these? Also, it could be an external actor. So we don't know who had the capacity to launch it. You also don't know who actually launched it. And to my mind, I think, even though I think a lot of neoclassical and like Chicago school economics assumes that human beings are overly rational, to the same extent, with regards to Assad, you don't hold on to power in an unstable country for a lengthy period of time and win a 7 year long civil war by having no savvy and being completely irrational. Like, if we're going to portray Assad as being a knuckle dragger, sociopath, like psychopath, that's just obviously not the case. You can think he's evil. You can think his regime is horrific. That's perfectly acceptable. My point is, if we're going to make the premise that Assad is some sort of lunatic, that's obviously not the case, or his regime would have collapsed by now. The fact that he's pretty much won at this point, I think, shows that he's a rational actor. So that furthers the question: whose interest is a chemical attack in at this point in time? Like, to me, before I look at the evidence, I think you have to a priori look at what are the motivations, who has to gain, who has not to gain. And once again, this isn't a conspiracy. This is just basic, like, analysis. Like, if you're in your someone took the last cookie out of the cookie jar, you have someone in your house who's on a diet, someone in your house who has a gluten allergy, and someone of your house who's a glutton who just eats everything in their path. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of look at motivations and patterns of behavior and figure out who probably took that last cookie. And in this case, what did Assad have to gain by using chemical weapons? The main thing at this point in time that can draw in international force at a time where he's basically won the civil war. ISIS is dead at this point. The kind of liberal opposition, or the fake democratic opposition in Syria, has basically been wiped out themselves. Al Qaeda's opposition is doing comparatively better, but they're basically being worn down. Russia, Iran, and friends have been providing them with a lot of support. And it's just going to be probably another year or so, and parts of the country might have guerrilla activity. But all the major cities have been either controlled by Assad or the Kurds at this point in time. So why would he risk international intervention by using chemical weapons when the war is basically over? If anything, logic suggests he would have used chemical weapons at the beginning of the war when ISIS was making its huge offensives and it was in doubt whether or not his regime would survive. Why they would be used as part of what amounts to a mopping up operation is insane. Like, if we look at the situation in March, all the major cities are now under Syrian government control, or the Kurds. Now, the Kurds and the Syrian government is kind of an interesting thing. They basically have an unofficial, I don't know if alliance, ceasefire, cooperation agreement. I'm not sure how you want to describe it exactly. But the Kurds and Syrian government really aren't actively fighting each other at this point. I think there's kind of a gentleman's agreement that at the end of the war, they'll come to terms and they'll have a negotiated peace, which will probably result in autonomy for the Kurdish parts of Syria and just short of outright independence, which is probably an agreement both sides can live with. The Kurds will have pretty much a self-rule within their parts of the country in exchange for not breaking off, and the Syrian government will not have to deal with their largest legitimate rival within Syria proper. So I mean, so at this point in time, like I said, that the rebels control some like crappy desert parts and some of urban Syria, but it's pretty much over at this point in time, particularly with the Russians, Iranians, and Iraqis, and Hezbollah providing all the additional muscle. So why would Assad do this? The answer is he wouldn't. So who has to gain from this? Is like I said, the question. The answer is ISIS has to gain from this, but ISIS is so depleted at this point, I don't think they'd be involved. So the two main people we have left are Al Qaeda and the fake democratic opposition. So let's look. Is this within Al Qaeda's or the various Islamist groups' modus operandi? Do they commit atrocities against civilian populations on a regular basis using unconventional means such as suicide bombing, chemical weapons, and flying airplanes into things? Yeah, they do. And what would they have to gain if a Western coalition overthrew the Syrian regime? Yes, they would, because they're more unified and more disciplined than the Syrian opposition is. So they could potentially kind of come up the middle in the chaos. So they have the most to gain. Russia, for what it's worth, and once again, you have to keep in mind, Russia has every incentive to take this position, has said that the attack was a false flag and that they have irrefutable proof that the attack was a false flag. Once again, you can believe that or not believe that, but given, like I said, looking at the motivations of the various parties, that does seem likely, because there's no reason for Assad to do this. There's every reason in the world for someone else to do this. You also have the fact that France got involved on this, which is kind of weird because France didn't really want to get involved with the other stuff. And with regards to Tunisia, they were the only ones who backed the current government prior to the rest of the world calling for it to overthrow. So France was not in favor of the Iraq War. Also, Macron is pretty notoriously liberal, but for whatever reason, Britain and America and France all got on board with it. And while Canada didn't participate directly, Justin Trudeau did endorse the action, which once again is very much out of character. The media has been beating the drums for a long time on this whole issue. They want war with Russia. They want war with Syria. So I think all the evidence, before we look at the actual circumstantial evidence, I mean all the background evidence, points towards this being a false flag attack by the Islamists or Syrian opposition, possibly with some sort of support, if not from the official governments, from actors within the coalition of France, Britain, and America. Most likely America, because there's been a sudden swing within the Trump administration towards more interventionist policies. So people talk about the deep state and stuff like that, but it's not really like a conspiracy to say that a large portion of the leadership of the Republican Party has a fetishistic love of Israel and still believes in the whole regime change, neoconservative ideal of a global world of liberal democracy. That's not controversial. That's just a fact. We saw this under the Bush administration. We've seen this under past administrations like Reagan and Bush Sr. So that definitely is very strong, and Trump has always been an outsider and not enjoyed any support of the Republican establishment, the people who actually are running the government now that he's taken it over. So the people are saying, was it the deep state? Was Trump forced to do this? Was he blackmailed? Was this like a wag the dog distraction from all the stuff that's happening home with the porn star and Trump Tower catching fire and all this other stuff? We don't really know what the hell's going on. And like I said, that's the scary thing, is that we don't know. Did Trump change his mind? Was this just he woke up and he's like, I feel like bombing something? Was he threatened? Was this like an action that someone within the government took on their own and he was stuck supporting it? Was it Britain or France who were trying to distract from local problems? We have absolutely no idea. And this complete lack of information is what makes the whole thing so disturbing. We also had the case of Mattis saying, oh, we have no evidence that Syria was behind it. Like a couple days before this bombing happened, they're like, oh, we're totally sure Syria's behind it. And Trump's talking about like war with Syria, and Mattis is like, oh no, this was a one-time thing. So if you're the Russians, you're going to be terrified. Just because you're facing off against a government in America that has absolutely no transparency and clarity. So what's going to happen next? We have no idea. I was wrong on this one. I thought Trump was either not going to do anything and this thing was just to appease aspects of the American public, or that Trump was going to make a token gesture. Now, was this a token gesture and he's not going to do anything else for the foreseeable future? I don't know. And like I said, if this was just a one-off thing and he did actually just destroy some of the chemical weapons stockpiles, that might be acceptable. Now, everybody is kind of saying at this point, we have to abandon Trump. We can't vote for him next time. And I'm not going to do that because that's knee-jerk, A. And B, we really don't have any other choices at this point in time. Maybe if there's a strong primary challenger, yes. But who else are we going to put in charge? Bernie Sanders? Some Hispanic guy who wants to open the border even more? Hillary Clinton on life support? I mean, who else is there? Hillary would have started a war with Russia. She might have started more wars than Trump is. Trump is, and I've said this, if nothing else, Trump will never appoint a Supreme Court justice who will find a hate speech clause or a you aren't allowed to own gun clause in the Constitution. I just don't think that's going to happen. And having him in power, if for that alone is worth it, having him in power for a lot of the people he's appointed to high-ranking positions in the bureaucracy alone is worth it. So can we criticize Trump? Yes. Can we attack him? Yes. But at the end of the day, we can't rage quit him and be like, oh, Trump is the worst, we're never going to vote for him again. I think we have to express our disappointment, and express our disappointment very strongly. Criticize him very strongly and put pressure on him to change what he's doing. But we can't abandon him at this point. We can't just throw him under the bus because we really don't have any other options in the immediate future in the political sphere. We've lost a lot of our momentum just in general, those of us who want to see change in the West for the better. And even if Trump isn't our guy, it still helps us to create a circumstance under which the environment for our message to get out is a lot better. So like I said, I'm not throwing Trump under the bus. I don't think you should or either. We're just going to have to see what happens and pray to God that the other people involved aren't as confused as we are and have a little bit better idea what he's doing. Anyways, that's my thoughts on the matter. I'll talk to you guys later.